All righty. Well, if you've not had your share of winter yet, I don't know, I guess you need to move somewhere, but most of us southern folks, we've had our share of winter, and things are, at least according to the weatherman, going to look up in the week ahead, so that's a good thing, but certainly it's been a challenging time, and it's been a time where you've probably had your schedule altered in a significant way, but again, as we said in prayer, it's good that we can be together this morning. I don't know that any of you here in the auditorium that are present, maybe some watching, will recognize the Hill name. That was their last name, Hill, the Hill family that lived in the area of Willow Grove. And if you're not familiar where Willow Grove is, it's in Overton County. And now about all that it's known for is that there is a body of water, an inlet, a marina there where you can launch your boat out onto Del Hollow Lake. But at one time, before the dam was built, there was a community there, the Willow Grove community. And the Hill family, Dr. Hill, he was a medical doctor. He was kind of the town father, so to speak, but he was also a Christian and established, or I won't say established, but was a prominent member there in the church and helped a lot of people in various ways, medically and physically and spiritually through the years. And I remember asking, I guess she might have been his granddaughter or daughter, I'm not sure, but her name was Sister Elise, and she worshiped with us at Allen's, and she was near 100, and I was visiting with her, and I just enjoy talking with those folks. And it was a cold snap, and I asked her, what was it like as a child, when weather got bad? You still went to church? And she said, oh yes, we still went to church. And I said, well, how'd you do it? Well, she said, Daddy would get the wagon out, and they would put all of us kids kind of in the back of a wagon. Now, some of you, if you're not a farm boy like me, you might not even recognize what I'm thinking about. Just a wagon, just a simple four-wheel wagon like you see on the old Western movies. But said Dad would get us out there, Mom early in the morning, and they'd put us down in there, and then Mom would pile up all the quilts that she had. And then Daddy would take and he'd just shovel straw or hay on top of us. And she said, about all you could see was just our little faces popped up. There were 7 or 8 kids, popped just out of that hay and straw underneath all of those quilts. And Daddy would drive us, I think she said it was 2 or 3 miles, to the church building. And then they'd sit around a potbelly stove. And, things are different now. And maybe they had it better than we did in some regards. It was a harder lifestyle. Now driving on treacherous roads, instead of having a couple of mules pulling you, you're behind the wheel of a 2,000-pound or more, weapon that can careen off to the side and take out someone's mailbox or, dent your bumper, or you take out someone else's automobile. So whether we've advanced or not, I guess that's a question that could be debated, but we're thankful that things are, as I said, as well with us as they are, that we have this opportunity to be in this comfortable place and study together. If you have the workbook, you notice that Lesson 3 is entitled, and these are some strange words. You probably say, I'm not sure I even know how to pronounce these correctly. Agape, phileo, storge, erosomai. Well, that's kind of a take on the Wizard of Oz. If you remember Dorothy singing lions, tigers, and bears, oh my. Well, what are these words that we're talking about? Well, we'll get to that momentarily, and they have to do with the words that the Bible uses on our study of love. Well, what is love? We've tried to define that a little bit already in this class, but we're building a foundation, and I promise, you might have said, I signed up for the class that said we're going to study 1 Corinthians 13. We are. We're going to get there. It's just going to maybe take us a little while to get there, but hopefully we'll get there in just a few weeks. This is all foundational. For some, love is an abstract noun, which means it's a word unattached to anything real and sensible. That's what most people, well, I won't say most people, but at least some people, I think, currently in our society think about love. It's just this concept that kind of floats out here, and I can just grab it whenever I want to and apply it to whatever I want to. And usually it's just related to some sort of feeling that I'm having at the moment. It's ethereal. It's not real. It's not tangible. It's not something, I can really wrap my mind around or even put my hands on. For others, it's a mean by which our being, ourself, and its world are irrevocably affected once we are touched by love. This is the idea that, I know what it is, even though I can't really analyze it. It's inexpressible. It's unexplainable, but, I know that it's real. And, that's something that, again, most people would maybe latch on to in contemporary culture and say that's what love is. Well, I like the Again, it goes back to an old kind of a country boy story that he left the farm after working for his daddy, his first 17 or 18 years of life, and he moves to the big city, and he comes back home, and he announces to, Dad and Mom, who have been anxious to see him after his months away, and he said, I'm in love. And they said, well, boy, what do you know about love? And he said, oh, Daddy and Mama, I'm in love. I know I'm in love. And Daddy said, well, tell me what that's like, boy. And he said, well, you know that feeling you think you're feeling when you're feeling a feeling you've never felt before? Daddy said, yeah, I know that feeling. And the boy said, well, that's what I'm feeling. Daddy said, well, you felt that same way when the mule kicked you, 3 or 4 summers ago upside the head. Well, that's true. Sometimes you're feeling a feeling you've never felt before. Is that love? Well, maybe, maybe not. It's undeniable, though, that love plays an enormous and unavoidable role in every culture, past, present, and will be for future, however long the world lasts. It's discussed, or at least it's the topic of songs and films and novels. Sometimes it's treated in a humorous way, sometimes in a serious way, sometimes even another way altogether. But it's a constant theme of maturing life. That is, as we get older, we recognize the value of it. I had a conversation yesterday with an individual, and they may be watching or listening this morning. And this individual told me before we were on the telephone together, before we ended our conversation, that they loved me. Now you may say, well, it must have been a family member. It was kind of indirectly, actually through Amy's family. But what was surprising is this was an individual that 20 years ago, if you would have asked me, does this person love me? I would have nodded in agreement. But if you would have asked me, would they express that love to you? I would have said, absolutely not. That would just be too awkward, too weird, for that person to say to me and me to say to them, But now we've both gotten older, and it was just a natural thing. And they said it first. Who says I love you first? Well, they said it first, and I responded in kind. I love you too. But, as we get older, maybe we realize we need to say that more often. We need to show that more often. And we appreciate the value of people. But certainly when we're young, there is that time when we're young, when we begin to have a feeling maybe of love for someone or something. It doesn't even always have to be another person. So both a constant theme of maturing life, a vibrant theme for youth. Let me take you down the road of philosophy for just a few moments. Dr. Lapp, this is his specialty, so if you have questions, just direct your questions to him because he's got the PhD in philosophy. But philosophically, love has been studied for centuries, especially since the time of the ancient Greeks. And they tried to really get at the heart at it. Where does this thing called love, where does it come from? And some would say, well, it's a purely physical phenomenon. It's a materialistic concept. It's something, and this kind of ties in. This is what those who don't believe in God would kind of jump in with their evolutionary idea and say that's what love is. It's just an instinct within you. And you love yourself, so when your belly starts growling, you put something in it to make it stop growling. You take away that hunger pain because you love yourself. But what that is not really something that is anything more than, again, a physical sensation, just your body recognizing that it's running out of fuel. And so that's what it is. Other theories of love from ancient times say that it's a sign of the spiritual. Now, again, we know the Bible gives us those answers to fundamental questions such as, who am I? Where did I come from? How did I get here? What am I here for? Where am I going? Those kind of fundamental questions. The Bible answers those. But for people that don't want to believe in the Bible, they've got to come up with some other source to answer, who am I? Where did I come from? What am I doing here? Where am I going? And so they've tried to define love in those ways and say, well, there is something spiritual about it. And it must relate to something that's beyond the realm of the physical, and it touches the supernatural realm of the divine. And the reason why they say that, maybe they've observed, animals don't act like we do, typically. Now, it's unfortunate that more and more human beings are acting more like animals than they are people, but nevertheless, they've tried to look at it from that perspective. Plato, there's 3 big names, and you've probably heard these if you've studied philosophy, any at all, even in a social studies class in 6th grade. But these three are kind of the big three guys. You have Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and they come in that order. Socrates, he kind of gets the credit of being the father of philosophy. His student was Plato, whose student was Aristotle. So Plato, the student of Socrates, said love is characterized by a series of elevations, meaning that you grow past this animalistic desire to something more, from a lust that just drives you physically to something more intellectual. And he said eventually it would even transcend sensual attraction and mutuality. Now, if that sounds confusing, I kind of meant for it to be, but you've heard this term before. You've heard of a platonic friendship. Or you might say, I have a platonic friendship. What does that mean? It means you have a relationship with someone on a very deep level, absent any physical component of that relationship. We'll just say it for what it is, no physical intimacy, no sexual activity, but you have a friendship with this person that is deeply emotional. Is that possible? Well, sure it is. And the Bible makes it clear that there are friendships like that. There is an attempt today, if you go back in your Old Testament and study about King David, you remember that he is, before king, chased by the then king Saul. But Saul has a son named Jonathan. And Jonathan and David, although we're not sure of their exact ages, it seems that they are relatively close in age. And they're friends. They're buddies. There's even a passage, I didn't take time to write it into my notes. I want to say it's somewhere around 1 Samuel 22. But David says to Jonathan, and they're having a very deep conversation about how Saul's trying to kill David and Jonathan's trying to prevent it. And even some versions of the Bible translate the statement this way: Jonathan and David's love, it was stronger than the love that they had for women. And what today, of course, is read into that by those who want to advance an agenda, particularly, of course, the homosexual agenda, is David and Jonathan were practicing homosexuals. But there is no evidence of that whatsoever in Scripture. And we know to the contrary, in fact, that both men were married, both men had children. That wouldn't necessarily preclude their activity in the other realm, but all that is saying, all that means is they had a deep friendship. And you may very well have a friend like that. You may very well, have a friend of the same sex like that. You may have, it's possible, I would think it would be very dangerous, I'm getting off on a tangent here, but for a male and a female to try to have that sort of relationship because of the natural physical, temptations that might arise of that, but that's Platonic. That's a Platonic relationship, as it's called, and that was Plato's idea of love, that love moves beyond the physical. It has no connection, if it gets to its highest level, to the physical. It's more on an emotional level. It's more in a sense, transcending even just what we can get out of it physically, to put it simply. There have been, and there continue to be, detractors and supporters of this sort of approach to love, and a host of alternative theories. Plato's student was Aristotle. I mentioned him a moment ago. He had a more secular view of love, and he said that love is simply, and he's famous for this quote, 2 bodies and 1 soul. And that can mean, that kind of sounds like an echo of Genesis 1, the 2 shall become 1 flesh in marriage. But he didn't really mean it that way. But nevertheless, you see that love has been studied again and again, over and over, from various viewpoints. But those who have been Christians, and that's what we're wanting to get to this morning, what does the Bible have to say? What are we going to learn from God's Word that is our authority on this subject? Well, you've probably heard a preacher or a Bible class teacher say at some point that the Greek language, which the New Testament was written in, what's called Koine Greek. Koine is a word that just means common. Why they didn't say common, I don't know, but koine is actually the word for common in English, so I guess that's why. But common Koine Greek. There is a version of the Greek language before the time the Bible was written called Classical Greek. That's the language that Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, Homer, all of those guys wrote in. But the New Testament language is what's called Koine, Common Greek. And the Common Greek language, though, is still very technical in some areas, certainly compared to our own English language of today. And you may have heard someone say, well, the Greek language has 4 words for love. And guys that are just starting out on their Greek journey, they like to know that. And it's exciting to learn new things and to try to share them with others. Sometimes it comes from a motivation of pride. I'm smarter than you guys. I've taken that class, you've not. So let me tell you that the Greek language has 4 words for love. Well, actually, it has more than that. It has up to probably 8, those who have studied it in much greater detail than have I. And I'm no expert myself. I'll make that affirmation on the back page. But what are those 4 words that are the most common? And you've heard these, especially the first 2, probably often over the course of your time in Bible study or listening to sermons. You've heard of the word agape. That word even sometimes is thrown around as a word used in the English language for different things. For instance, in the Middle Tennessee area, in and around, I believe, Nashville is where it had its start, but it's now spread to other parts of the state. There is an agency that helps children, sometimes with adoption, sometimes with various aspects of child welfare, called Agape. That's just the name of the organization, and they provide different services to children, counseling and placement and things of that nature. But they take that word, and if you just do a Google search on the internet, you'll find that that word has been borrowed and lifted for that purpose in various places, not just in Nashville. But there's a word in the New Testament translated into English as love that comes from the Greek word agape. There's another word called phileo. And each of these are actually noun forms of the verb, but I won't bore you with those details. But phileo. And then there are 2 words, storge and eros. That's the quartet of words. And so let me go through them really quickly, and then we're going to look at one passage in the Gospel of John that has been made a big deal out of. And I don't think really necessarily that it's necessary for us to do that. There is a word in the Greek language spoken during the time that the New Testament was written called eros. And it's used to refer primarily to the type of love constituting a passionate, intense desire for something. Okay, a passionate, intense desire for something. Now, that word has been, if you will, taken from its ancient context, and into English it comes into our English word erotic. And when I say that word, I know that a lot of people's antennas go up, and you say, wait, we don't need to talk about that, and we're not going to in detail. I don't want to be crass or vulgar in any way, but there is the modern notion of what is erotic. And that word, as it is typically used in a contemporary, in a modern setting in 2023, refers to those things that are sexually deviant. And it usually refers to, in a class of things, for instance, under another broad term of pornography, for instance. And there's a lot of different things that would fall under that umbrella. And I know that's not something that most people want to think about at length, but nevertheless, that's where that word comes from. Now again, Platonic philosophers, Plato would say that doesn't match what I'm trying to say. He would disagree with that modern emphasis. He would just say eros can describe an intense love even absent the physical component, even absent any sort of physical manifestation of it. Now, the word eros or eros does not appear even once in any form in the New Testament. Now, what the New Testament does teach, and the Old Testament as well, it does describe the beauty of marital love and the intimacy that should go along with it. And that's not something that we should shy away from. That's not something that we should be ashamed of, for instance. That's something that the Bible makes clear. From Genesis chapter 1, God said, I'll make them male and female. That's how He made us. And the first instruction that God gave to that first couple in Genesis 1 was, be fruitful and multiply. When Eve is presented to Adam, he said, at last, this is what I've been looking for. He understood she was a complement to him. He could see all of the animals, and you've heard me use this illustration again and again. Adam, as he named the animals, he could see Mr. Cow and Mrs. Cow, if you want to say it that way. He could see Mr. Giraffe and Mrs. Giraffe. He could see that there was, and you don't have to be, a biology major to appreciate that physiologically our anatomy is different. God made us male and female, and the whole idea today that's rampant of the idea that I can change my gender. Gender is what we call a social construct. The Bible doesn't know anything of gender. The Bible knows of sex in the sense of male and female, biological realities of how God made us. Gender is what we have made up in the 19th century and coming forward now into the 21st century. We've made that up to say, well, that's just how I feel. And so today I might feel like a man. Tomorrow, if I want to feel like a woman, that's okay. And I just use it to my, it seems, advantage, whatever the case may be. And so I can transition, I can transgenderize my experience. And all of that nonsense, I won't take time to get into that or I'll get too far down the rabbit trail. But the New Testament never uses this word eros to refer to erotic sexual love, but it does describe intimacy between a husband and a wife and talks about that relationship wherein that physical activity is to be enjoyed within marriage should be celebrated. And we need to help our children especially understand that. We need to help them to understand there's a place, the time and the place, it's marriage. And within that context, there is nothing out of place, or there is nothing about that relationship that's displeasing to God if both partners are, of course, loving toward each other in it. And we could talk about that. Come to marriage class. We've done that with our young couples this past quarter. The next word is storge. And that word in Greek is usually a little bit more technical to describe a family bond, the strong bond shared by family members. One lexicon defines it as a protective love that can withstand hardships and trials. Now this word appears twice, and actually it doesn't appear as storge, but it appears with a negative to negate storge, ha storge, and it appears in Romans 1:31 and 2 Timothy 3:3. Now if you turn to either of those passages, you'll find that what is described in both passages is a lack of love. Romans chapter 1 and verse 31, Paul is describing the wicked people of the first century world in Rome and elsewhere in the empire. And he said that many of them were undiscerning, untrustworthy, unloving, unforgiving, and unmerciful. And he describes that as a mindset that is against the way that God would have us to operate. An unloving person is a person that is not pleasing to God. Now you might say, well, that's kind of generic, and it is, but looking closer, it's a word that is unloving toward those to whom he should especially be loving toward. And in one sense, we could say that includes all people, but when you turn, for instance, to 2 Timothy 3:3, and Paul is describing what will happen when what he talks about the falling away, perilous times will come, things that will characterize people that will turn away from God. He says in verse 3 that the first on that list, as our Bibles are divided, these people would be unloving. Your Bible might say in either place, without natural affection. That's an old way of putting it. Instead of loving God, they'll instead love themselves. They'll be unthankful and unholy. Again, unloving. So both passages describe sinful, terrible behavior of those who turn away from God and are selfish. And that will manifest itself in various ways, among which one of those ways would include their natural love that they should show for those that they ought to be closest to. They will fail to demonstrate. So that's the word storge. Now we come to the two words used in our English translations for love. And there has been much debate, and this is just my sentence at the bottom of the page before we flip to the back. There has been much debate between linguists, lexicographers, philologists, Bible scholars, interpreters, and others going to the back page studying New Testament Greek. In other words, what I'm presenting to you this morning probably sounds a little dull, but this occupies the thinking of a lot of individuals with very high credentials in this area of study. How much differentiation exists between the Greek word phileo and agape? And I'll go ahead and let the cat out of the bag. I can't give you a definitive answer. And you may say, well, why are we even studying this to begin with? Well, there's a point, and I hope to make it before our class is over. Whatever view you adopt, it does not negate the plain teaching of Scripture. Let's go to John 21. I told you this is Bible class, so we need to study that for sure. So let's jump to John 21, and to set the context, you know, of course, by this time in John's Gospel, Jesus has been put to death. His crucifixion has already occurred. In chapter 20, 3 days later, the first day of the week, Sunday morning, Mary Magdalene goes. She's going to do some of the preparation of the body of Jesus that was not done in the haste that was his burial late on Friday afternoon. And she finds that the tomb, the stone has been rolled back that had covered it, and the tomb is empty. And she comes back and reports that. Peter and John run to the tomb, and they confirm, in fact, that what she had said was true. And so they kind of depart for a little while, and then Mary, while she's still there, maybe in her shocked state, sees two angels, one at the head and one at the feet of where the body of Jesus would have been placed. What are you crying about? Basically, they ask her in John 20:13. They've taken away my Lord, she says. I don't know where they have laid him. She turns around and sees Jesus there. She doesn't recognize that it's him. And Jesus said to go back and tell the apostles, tell my men, tell my followers that in fact you have seen me. So she does. Jesus appears to them later that evening, and then a week later he appears to them again after Thomas had doubted and said, you know, put your fingers in the nail prints. Thomas, put your hand here in my side. Confirmation again that this was in fact Jesus, their Savior, their teacher who had died and is alive again. Well, Jesus had told them he would be ascending back to the Father, so it seems they depart from Jerusalem and they go back up north toward home, back toward the region around the Sea of Galilee. And John 21:3 is a favorite of many guys. Simon Peter said to him, I'm going fishing. So, you know, if you're having a tough day, just tell your boss, I've got to do what the Bible says. I'm going fishing. That probably won't work. That's a poor attempt at a joke. But nevertheless, Peter says, I'm going fishing. The other says, we'll go with you. So they get into the boat. They've done this many times. Remember, Peter, Andrew, James, and John, they're all fishermen. So this isn't nothing new for them. They're not doing it for leisure. They're doing it for their commercial, business. But they catch nothing. Now that's the true part of the verse. If you go fishing with me, if you go fishing with a preacher, you'll spend all day or all night, however long you want to take, and we'll probably catch nothing. The morning comes, they're tired, they're weary. You know, this hasn't been a fun experience at all. But nevertheless, they see a guy standing on the seashore, and maybe he's a sufficient distance away that they can't make it out exactly who it is, but sound travels across the water. And so he's able to kind of shout out to them, children, do you have any food? Did you catch any fish? No, is their response. Cast the net on the other side and you'll find some. Now, if you've studied the Gospels to this point, you know Jesus has already used this trick on them. They don't make an objection here, whether they're again certain or not, it's Jesus, but maybe they're just thinking, you know, what can it hurt? Well, they cast the net on the other side and there's so many fish they can't even, pull them back into the boat. And John, the light bulb clicks on for him, that disciple whom Jesus loved, as he identifies himself in verse 7 and throughout the gospel by the same kind of little nickname there. It is the Lord. That's Jesus. Only Jesus could tell us, put the net on the other side and we'll catch something. And Peter, he says, you're right, I've seen this story play out before. Peter heard that it was the Lord. He put on his outer garment. He had removed it, plunged into the sea. He wasn't working, without any clothing, but just kind of his outer garment to have a little bit more modesty or decorum. And he swims. What distance, we don't know, but he finally gets to the seashore. They drag it says about 200 cubits when I said we didn't know the exact distance. About a football field is what most people suspect they were distance away. All of the fish are brought up to the shore. Jesus already has some cooking there, and they enjoy breakfast together. None of the disciples, notice verse 12, dared ask him, who are you? Knowing that it was the Lord. That was probably a wise thing to refrain from doing. Jesus then came, took the bread, gave it to them, likewise the fish. This is now the third time Jesus showed himself to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. So, when they had eaten breakfast, here's the exchange, and you've heard this often. John chapter 21, verses 15 to 17. Jesus asked Simon Peter, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me more than these?" I'm going to insert, and if you have the handout you can see this clearly, but I'm going to insert the word that is used here in the original language to highlight the contrast. Jesus asked Simon Peter, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you agape me? Do you love agape me?" He, Peter, said to him, to Jesus, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love phileo you." I love, you know that, phileo you. Jesus said to him again, to Peter again a second time, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love agape me?" Peter said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love phileo you." He said to him the third time, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love," this time Jesus, "do you love," Peter, "phileo me?" Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, "Do you love phileo me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love phileo you." Now, again, that doesn't come out if you had no acquaintance whatsoever with the original language and you had never heard anyone, read this to you or point that out. You would read through that like I did for many years before it was exposed to me and really be quite confused. Do you love me? Well, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Okay. Do you love me? You know that I love you. Do you love me? Peter was grieved because he asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" It almost, reading it that way, just in English without what I've inserted for you, just seems like that Peter's, a bit, he's filled with consternation. He's filled with a bit of, I won't say disappointment, but that's part of it, but also a little bit of frustration. Now, why ask the question three times? Why use different words? All of these considerations come into play. I won't say the natural, but the most frequent given understanding and explanation is Jesus asked Peter three times because earlier during his trial, Peter had done what? Denied Jesus three times. And so now Jesus is giving Peter an opportunity to affirm three times what he had denied three times earlier during the trial of Jesus. Is that the understanding? There's a strong case to be made, and I would have no problem in making that type of interpretation probably a very logical possibility. But it is curious, and that's what the lesson is about this morning. Why does Jesus use one word, a word agape, that is a very strong word that talks about not just a feeling, but reason and will and decision making, and Peter used a word that has less intensity according to some? That is the love more of just personal affection and attachment. That's not really quite as committed, if you will. Is that what's going on? I'm going to read this to you, and those that can follow along on the handout, you can read with me. Others, I'll get this to you, as I said, next week, but I'll read it slowly just to let you see how one commentator, his name's R.C. Linsky, he's long dead now, but he wrote this back in about a century ago, but he was an expert in the original language, and he said this, quote, "He, Peter, does not even venture to assert a love for Jesus such as agape indicates." Okay, he's making that his primary position. Peter knows Jesus has loved him in this way, but he's unwilling to say he loves Jesus in that same way that Jesus had loved him. Even now, with bowed head, he, Peter himself, realizes that his love has been anything but the high love of the true understanding of his Lord and of the sincere purpose of living up to that understanding. Now, this goes back really to the totality of what we know about Peter's character. Peter is always the guy that in the Gospels is presented how? He's the guy that jumps and then halfway down wonders, I wonder how deep this hole is. We always hear the adage, look before you leap. Think before you act. Peter's a guy that acts and then thinks. That's just kind of his nature. He's impetuous. We use that word often as an adjective to describe his behavior. Peter, very frequently, he's the guy, sometimes, he shows some courage, even though it may be foolhardy courage. Jesus is walking on the water. Well, let me come too. And he jumps over the side and starts walking to Jesus. I commend him for his courage. He takes his eyes off of Jesus. He begins to sink. Sometimes it works in his favor. Sometimes it doesn't. Linsky says, though, but now Peter has kind of come to the realization, I need to do some further reflecting. Jesus has loved me. I've seen how much Jesus loved me. I saw him die on the cross. I heard myself deny him 3 times. And now he's asking, do I love him? I love him, but not like he loves me. Is that the right understanding? So often he had misunderstood. So often Jesus had to correct Peter's wrong impulses. No, Peter dared not claim real agape, real love. So Peter answers, phileo. I have affection for thee. When Jesus twice asked about the higher love, remember, do you agape me, Peter? Once as to its degree compared with others, and then about its very presence, Peter, with all due humility. You remember that's a characteristic that's not often been found in this man, perhaps. Peter, with all due humility, ventured to assert only the lower form of love. But now in this third question, the third time Jesus said, Simon, Peter, do you phileo me? Jesus probed even for this lower love of which Peter felt so sure that for its presence in his heart, he could appeal to the omniscience of Jesus. That is, Jesus, you know all things. You know that I've got that. You don't even have to ask about it. So, is this the right understanding of the passage? Many have taken these words of Linsky and ran with them and said he's absolutely correct. Well, again, if we're assuming, and Linsky is, that phileo is the love of affection and personal attachment, agape is the love of spirit and reason, then maybe there's something to it. But is there that big of a difference, and what does it matter to us? Here's where hopefully it'll begin to all tie together for you. The Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, which is a standard reference work on the New Testament language, says, quote, as it regards agape and that type of love, quote, Jesus demands love with an exclusiveness, which means that all other commands lead up to it and all righteousness finds in its norm. For Jesus, too, love is a matter of will and action. And if you take nothing away from the class this morning, that's what I want you to take. Love is a matter of will and action. What am I trying to say? To give you the opposite or the contrast. Love is more than just what you say. Love is much more than just what you feel. Love, according to Jesus, is a matter of will and action. And no matter in what context you use love, this has to be our understanding of it. This has to be our understanding as it relates to our spouses. You can tell them every morning when you wake up. You can kiss them on the forehead and say, I love you. You can say it, at every meal. You can say it multiple times throughout the day before you close your eyes to go to sleep. You can say it again. But unless your actions back up during that time that you're awake by will and action, something that demonstrates that your words are genuine, your words are nothing more than that. That's the point. The same to your children. The same to your God. Again, there's not a person in this room, there are very few people in the entirety of the county that would deny that they love Jesus, but they don't show it by their will and by their actions. Well, if you want to read this, I'll be happy to let you read it. I think it's some odd 40 or 50 pages. I read it in preparation for this lesson. After they give their discussion at length between this phileo and agape differentiation, if there should be one, here's how they conclude, quote, plainly the author wants this solemnly confirmed. Exceptional love of Peter for Jesus to be regarded as a counterpart to the exceptional love of Jesus for the beloved disciple. In this way, it would appear that he wants to relate the two disciples in a special manner, though one that we can no longer understand today. In other words, we need to be careful in trying to differentiate these two ideas so much in our mind as I've heard some preachers do, and say, well, you can just kind of like people, you don't have to love them. You can like people, but you don't really have to show it. Jesus will say to love your enemies. That may mean that you don't like what they do, but it does mean your kindness and compassion for them must be observable, must be seen in your will and action. So maybe there's a little bit too much of a distinction made between those two words. We must decide both to love and to feel a love for God, both to show it in how we feel, but also in what we do. And His Word declares that in numerous passages. Let me give you this to just take home with you. What is love according to Scripture? This is about the best definition that I can come up with, especially as it relates to how we treat each other and other people also. Love is the willing self-sacrifice for the good of another that does not require reciprocation or that the person being loved is deserving. Listen to that one more time and the lesson's yours. Love is the willing self-sacrifice for the good of another that does not require, that is the person you're loving, their reciprocation or that the person being loved that you're giving it to is even deserving. That's the kind of love God has had for us. That's the love we need to have for each other. Now your question might be by way of follow-up is, how then can we love God? And in one sense, we cannot love Him in that way because He does not need my love. But what He does ask of me is that I love others in order to show my love for Him. That's our challenge for this week, and that's what I hope that you'll be engaged in doing. Thank you for your kind attention on this morning. We hope we can study again together next Sunday morning.